You're standing in the torchlit Great Hall of Memphis, watching something that will haunt you forever. The air, thick with frankincense and myrrh, so heavy you can taste the sacred smoke on your tongue. Before you, two figures stand draped in cloth of gold, their faces painted with the ceremonial makeup of divinity. They are about to be married. They are brother and sister, and one of them has already buried two murdered sons. The woman's hands don't tremble as the high priest of Ptah places the double crown of Egypt upon her head. She has learned not to show weakness. Her name is Arsinoe II, and this is the third time she has been traded in marriage to secure a kingdom. The first husband was old enough to be her grandfather. The second was her half-brother who slaughtered her children on their wedding night. Now she stands beside her full brother, Ptolemy II, in a ceremony that will redefine queenship itself. If you're fascinated by how the most powerful women in history transformed trauma into triumph, consider subscribing and hitting that like button. I'd love to know where in the world you're watching from. Drop a comment below. It's incredible that we're all here, scattered across continents and time zones, connected by our shared curiosity about the women who refuse to be victims of their own stories. This is not a love story. This is not even a story about desire. This is a story about survival at the highest stakes imaginable, where the price of power was paid in blood, sanity, and the very boundaries of what it meant to be human. The woman before you has already lost everything. Tonight, she will transform that loss into divinity itself. The priests are chanting in a language older than Homer, older than the Greek alphabet, older than the very concept of democracy that the Hellenic world holds so dear. They are invoking Isis and Osiris, the divine siblings whose incestuous union created the cosmic order itself. And as you watch, you begin to understand something that will change how you see power forever. Sometimes the only way to escape a cage is to make yourself the key. To understand how Arsinoe reached this moment, we must first understand the world that created her. Born around 316 BCE in Alexandria, she entered existence at the precise intersection of Greek ambition and Egyptian mysticism. Her father, Ptolemy I, had been one of Alexander the Great's 7 bodyguards, trusted companions who had marched with him from Macedonia to India and back again. When Alexander died in Babylon at 32, his empire shattered like dropped pottery, and Ptolemy was among the men quick enough and ruthless enough to grab a piece. But Ptolemy didn't just seize Egypt, he stole it with theatrical brilliance. As Alexander's funeral cortege made its way back to Macedonia, Ptolemy hijacked the body itself, bringing the world conqueror's corpse to Memphis and later Alexandria. It was a propaganda coup of staggering audacity. Whoever possessed Alexander's body could claim to be his legitimate heir. And in the Mediterranean world of 320 BCE, legitimacy was the currency that mattered most. The Ptolemaic dynasty that Ptolemy founded was different from the other successor kingdoms. The Seleucids in Syria and the Antigonids in Macedonia ruled as Greek kings over Greek territories. But Egypt was different. Egypt had been ancient when Greece was young, had built the pyramids when the ancestors of Homer's heroes were still herding goats in the Peloponnese. Egypt had pharaohs who were gods, temples that stretched back 3 millennia, and a bureaucratic system that had been calculating grain taxes since before the Trojan War. Ptolemy understood this. He couldn't simply rule Egypt as a Greek king, he had to become pharaoh, to step into a role that was as much religious as political. And pharaohs, as any Egyptian priest could tell you, played by different rules than mortal men. They could marry their sisters. They could become gods. They could perform rituals that would make a Greek philosopher vomit in horror. Into this world of calculated divinity and political theater, Arsinoe was born. She was the daughter of Ptolemy's second wife, Berenice I, a woman who had clawed her way from relative obscurity to queenship through intelligence and ruthless charm. Young Arsinoe would have grown up bilingual, speaking Greek in the marble halls of the palace but learning Egyptian from the nurses and servants who raised her. She would have watched the daily temple rituals, seen the priests perform ceremonies that predated Homer by 1,000 years. Most importantly, she would have learned the fundamental lesson of Hellenistic royalty. You are not a person. You are an asset. Your beauty, your fertility, your bloodline, these do not belong to you. They belong to the dynasty, to be spent like coins wherever they might purchase the greatest advantage. In 300 BCE, when Arsinoe was approximately 15 years old, her father made his first transaction with her life. The buyer was Lysimachus, king of Thrace, a man who had fought beside Alexander at the Granicus River, at Issus, at Gaugamela. He was now 55 years old, his body a roadmap of scars, his reputation carved from a lifetime of brutality. He was called the Lion Killer, for having strangled a lion with his bare hands in Alexander's menagerie. To teenage Arsinoe, he must have seemed less like a bridegroom than like violence given human form. The wedding took place in Sardis, that ancient Persian capital where Croesus had once displayed his gold. Imagine the scene through Arsinoe's eyes, the marble columns stretching toward painted ceilings, the air heavy with wine and roasted meat, the assembled nobles of 3 continents watching as this girl-child was handed to a man old enough to be her grandfather. Her robes were Egyptian linen dyed with Tyrian purple, so expensive that the color itself was a statement of power. Her jewelry was Greek gold worked by Egyptian craftsmen, a fusion of cultures that she herself embodied. Lysimachus placed his ring on her finger with hands that had held Alexander's stirrup 30 years before. Those hands had killed dozens of men in battle, had throttled a lion, had signed death warrants for countless enemies. Now they claimed her as property, as the price of an alliance between Thrace and Egypt. The marriage was not cruel in the sense of active malice. Lysimachus does not seem to have abused her, does not appear to have treated her worse than any other royal wife of the era. But the very nature of the transaction was a kind of violence. A teenage girl sold to secure her father's eastern border, her personhood subsumed entirely into the logic of empire. What saved Arsinoe, or perhaps what doomed her to an even stranger fate, was her capacity for survival. Within a year, she was pregnant. The child, a son named Ptolemy after her father, was born in 299 BCE. 2 more sons followed, another Lysimachus in 297 BCE, and Philip in 294 BCE. Each birth strengthened her position at court, transformed her from disposable bride into the mother of potential heirs. But Lysimachus already had a son, Agathocles, born to his first wife. And in the deadly calculus of Hellenistic succession, multiple possible heirs meant inevitable bloodshed. The court of Thrace became a nest of vipers. Agathocles' supporters whispered that Arsinoe was a foreign sorceress, an Egyptian witch who had corrupted the old king. Arsinoe's faction countered that Agathocles was unsuitable, that the kingdom needed fresh blood, Egyptian gold, and the diplomatic connections that only a Ptolemaic heir could provide. Every smile concealed a dagger, every compliment was a test. And then, in 283 BCE, Agathocles was arrested on charges of treason. The evidence was circumstantial, the accusations convenient. Within days, he was dead, executed on his father's orders. Ancient sources differ on who was responsible. Some claim Arsinoe seduced her elderly husband into eliminating his rival. Others argue she simply presented him with political realities he could not ignore. The truth, as always, was probably more complex than either version. What matters is the result. Arsinoe's sons were now the clear heirs to Thrace, and she had blood on her hands whether she wielded the knife or simply pointed at the target. The victory was short-lived. Agathocles' death fractured the kingdom, creating factions that would never reconcile. And the other Diadochi, the successor kings who had carved up Alexander's empire, sensed weakness like sharks scenting blood in the water. In 281 BCE, Seleucus Orf Nicator, the last of Alexander's original bodyguards still living, invaded Anatolia with a massive army. He claimed to be avenging Agathocles, but everyone understood the truth. He was simply seizing an opportunity to destroy a rival. At the Battle of Corupedium, the two old men who had once served Alexander together faced each other for the final time. Lysimachus fell in the fighting, his body pierced by spears, and with his death the kingdom of Thrace collapsed like a sandcastle before the tide. Arsinoe, now 35 years old and a widow, found herself in the most dangerous position imaginable. She had 3 sons to protect, but no army to defend them. Seleucus was advancing on the capital, and every noble who had resented her rise was now positioning themselves for the new order. She was a foreign queen in a hostile land, and her husband's death had transformed her from an asset into a liability. But Arsinoe had not survived 2 decades of Hellenistic court intrigue by being passive. Even as messengers brought news of the disaster at Corupedium, she was already planning her next move. She gathered what treasure she could carry, secured the loyalty of her personal guard, and prepared to flee. The woman who had arrived at Sardis in a bridal litter 21 years earlier now faced the prospect of running for her life. Yet, before she could escape, another player entered the game. Ptolemy Coronis, Ptolemy Thunderbolt, was Arsinoe's half-brother, the son of Ptolemy Theban by a different wife. He had been passed over for the succession in Egypt, had nursed his grievances in foreign courts for decades, and had been living as a guest of Seleucus. But ambition makes men reckless, and impatience makes them stupid. At the very moment of his host's triumph, Coronis murdered Seleucus and seized his army, proclaiming himself king of Macedonia. The news reached Arsinoe as she sheltered in a coastal city, her sons beside her, her future uncertain. And with that news came an offer: marriage. Coronis promised to acknowledge her sons as his heirs, to give them the kingdom that Lysimachus had lost. He spoke of family loyalty, of Ptolemaic blood, of destiny. Arsinoe listened to these words with a face like carved stone. She was not a naive 15-year-old anymore, but a woman of 40 who had seen the full horror of what men would do for power. She knew exactly what Coronis was: a murderer, an opportunist, a man who had betrayed his own benefactor. But she also knew that her options were limited. Her sons needed protection, and she needed a throne from which to provide it. The decision to accept was the most difficult of her life. She was walking into a trap with her eyes open, gambling everything on the hope that blood might mean something, that family ties might prove stronger than political calculation. But she was also making a strategic choice. If disaster struck, at least she would face it from a position of some authority rather than as a refugee. What she did next showed both maternal wisdom and bitter experience. She sent her eldest son, Ptolemy, away to safety. If the worst happened, and in her heart, she must have known it would at least one of her children might survive. The ceremony took place in Pella, ancient capital of Macedonia, in the palace where Alexander the Great had been raised. It should have been a triumph. Arsinoe was marrying into the Macedonian throne, her sons positioned to inherit Alexander's homeland itself. The priests performed the traditional Greek rites, invoking Zeus and Hera themselves, divine siblings whose marriage sanctified such unions in myth, if not in mortal practice. But Coronis had no intention of honoring his promises. The man they called Thunderbolt for his swift, brutal ambitions had married Arsinoe for one reason only: to eliminate the threat her sons represented to his rule. With their mother safely in his power, he could deal with them at his leisure. The betrayal came on the wedding night itself. While the feast was still underway, while guests were still toasting the health of the new queen, Coronis's soldiers surrounded the palace quarters where Arsinoe's 2 younger sons were staying. Lysimachus, 15 years old, and Philip, 12, were dragged from their beds. According to some accounts, they were murdered in front of their mother, their blood staining the marble floors while she screamed. Other sources suggest she heard of their deaths only hours later, waking from her wedding bed to discover that her new husband had become her children's executioner. The horror of that night is almost impossible to comprehend. Arsinoe had survived 2 decades of marriage to Lysimachus, had played the deadly game of succession politics, had seen kingdoms rise and fall, but nothing could have prepared her for this betrayal, this absolute violation of the most sacred promises. She had traded herself to protect her sons, and her husband had murdered them on their wedding night. But even in this moment of ultimate desperation, Arsinoe refused to surrender. The woman who had learned survival in the courts of Lysimachus was not about to let Coronis's brutality be her end. Even as guards watched her every move, even as servants reported her every word, she began to plot her escape. How she managed it remains one of history's great mysteries. The sources speak of loyal servants, of a network of slaves and freedmen who helped her slip away from Pella in the dead of night, disguised as a common woman. She left behind a decoy, a slave who resembled her, buying precious hours before the deception was discovered. It was an escape worthy of legend, a queen becoming invisible, shedding her identity like a snake shedding skin to survive. Her destination was the island of Samothrace, a sacred sanctuary where ancient mystery cults offered protection even to fugitives. The journey was nightmare made flesh, traveling through hostile territory, hunted by Coronis's soldiers, a refugee queen carrying only the clothes on her back and the trauma of unspeakable loss. But Arsinoe reached Samothrace, and from that sacred ground she began to plan her next move. She had lost 2 sons, lost 2 kingdoms, lost everything except the iron will to survive. She had one remaining asset. Her brother, Ptolemy II, now ruled Egypt as pharaoh, and she was the daughter of the dynasty's founder. If she could reach Alexandria, if she could convince him to shelter her, she might yet find a way to rebuild her shattered life. When Arsinoe arrived in Alexandria in 276 BCE, she was returning to a city she had not seen in 25 years. The palace of her childhood was now ruled by a brother she barely knew, Ptolemy II. Philadelphus was 28 years old, a scholar king who had inherited his father's kingdom but none of his military genius. Egypt was prosperous under his rule, but Ptolemy II was cautious, intellectual, more comfortable with books than with battles. The reunion between siblings was charged with complexity. Arsinoe was no longer the teenage princess who had departed for Sardis. She was a 40-year-old woman scarred by tragedy, hardened by survival, carrying the weight of 2 murdered sons and 2 failed marriages. She was desperate for sanctuary, but also dangerous, a potential rival with her own claim to legitimacy, her own network of supporters, her own formidable intelligence. The negotiations were a quiet war of need and ambition. Arsinoe wanted more than shelter. She wanted rebirth, a throne, a purpose. Ptolemy II, ruling uneasily, needed something too: legitimacy. His current wife, Arsinoe II, offered heirs but no power. Arsinoe II offered something rarer: understanding. The solution was unthinkable. He would divorce his wife and marry his sister. Not a half-sister, as Greek rulers sometimes did, but his full sister, same mother, same father. To Greek eyes, it was incest. To Egyptian priests, it was sacred. For centuries, pharaohs had followed the divine pattern of Isis and Osiris. Siblings joined to sustain cosmic order. What shocked Greece made Egypt rejoice. Their wedding in Memphis around 273 BCE glittered with ancient ritual. The high priest of Ptah presided as they wore the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, recited words spoken by kings for 3,000 years, and were hailed as divine. Smoke from incense curled toward the gods as the crowd murmured, "Pharaoh and goddess reborn." Alexandria buzzed with scandal, but along the Nile, temples opened their doors in celebration. The Greeks saw corruption. Egyptians saw restoration. Arsinoe became Philadelphus, the sister-loving, worshipped beside her brother as Theoi Philadelphoi. divine siblings of the throne. In life, she ruled fiercely guiding wars, shaping policy, nurturing the library's scholars. Yet, beneath the gold and ceremony, who knows what she mourned? The sons lost to murder, the youth sacrificed to survival. When she died in 270 BCE, Ptolemy grieved deeply. He made her a goddess, eternal and adored, and through her a dynasty was defined. Cleopatra's divine marriages, her claim as Isis reborn, all of it began with Arsinoe. The queen, once trapped by incest, had turned it into power, forging immortality from pain.